Welcome to the LFSPN's April talk, which shall be about what is no longer taught about marriage. Before I begin, I'd like to say happy St. George's Day. Yes, indeed. Patron saint of England, patron saint of nobility and chivalry, and all that is good, although I see that people don't wear roses anymore on St. George's Day in this country. Yes, well, I'm going to talk to you about marriage, but what I'm not going to talk about are my personal experiences, because I don't think that they're relevant. I'm not going to talk about other people's personal experiences. I'm going to talk about what is the doctrine of the Catholic Church and what is the problem with the modern world. Although, for those of you who are more seriously researched in the faith, I will try and distinguish as to what is the tradition of the Church, what is preconciliar, what is post-conciliar traditionalist, and what is modernist, where possible. If I say something and you're unsure, then feel free to ask. Feel free to interrupt with short questions, but long questions, if you could keep until the end, jot them down perhaps, in case you forget. So I'm going to start off by delineating a couple of terms. First of all, because it's very difficult to talk about this without being a little bit vulgar with some of it, so I'm going to try my very best not to be. I'll try and be tasteful, but we'll have to start off with, do you all understand what I mean by the marital act?
Yeah.
Does anyone not? It's all right. Yes, it's something that is taught about in biological textbooks generally as sexual relations and so on. But when we talk about the marital act, we mean something that is within the bounds of marriage. It's a good, beautiful, wonderful thing approved by God and so on. Whereas, do you all know what I mean when I talk about the differences between these terms? Celibacy, abstinence, chastity, fornication, adultery. So some of these are very similar, but and they're often sort of misused. They're all often crossed over with one another. But celibacy, do you all sort of know the difference between celibacy and abstinence? You think so? I won't bother sort of asking you what envision and so on. It's all just the main difference is, so one is sort of celibacy is all together for a whole life, perhaps a commitment, perhaps an oath and so on, a vow. Whereas abstinence is just it's altogether doing none of it by choice, whereas chastity is still engaging in things like the marital act, but in a way that's quite right and not quite wrong. Whereas fornication is something that's between unmarried persons, again, which is often misused these days to mean all sexual relations and so on. And separation and divorce are often confused as well. Adultery is often misunderstood as well as meaning fornication. But the difference there is that a married person can commit adultery or an unmarried person with a married person, you see. And if you look at the people to whom these refer, that celibacy generally refers to the consecrated religious. So that's not just priests, it's often monks and nuns. It's a few other people as well. I believe a lot of Opus Dei have a vow of celibacy as well. Whereas abstinence is everyone who's unmarried. As you can see here. Whereas separation, this is important because that it's often the clergy will give permission for it, and in that case it's not a sin. If there is a serious issue within a marriage, they'll allow separation as what they consider to be a temporary phase while things get back to normal again. Whereas it's considered to be very rare that they'll allow it for any longer than a few years. Sadly, this isn't often the case anymore, and some people just take these things into their own hands, which is illicit separation, which is a sin, rather than something that's specifically permitted by the clergy. In theory, usually a bishop, but these days more often a priest. Whereas, of course, yes, the difference between divorce and separation is it's not just people separating, it's the fact that they've got the license to remarry. But most of you probably knew all of that anyway, but just making sure. Because we will be talking about all these things. So if we start off with what is marriage? Where does all of this come from? Of course, men and women are born in roughly equal proportion. About half of everyone who's born is one or the other. And of course, we've got hugely unequal faculties. Men are very different to women. So it makes sense that we form pairs. And we pair up and we can do everything a lot better. And one of the things that we're charged to do at the very beginning of Scripture is to increase and multiply, sometimes go forth and multiply, fill the earth, which from the beginning is, it starts off with, of course, Adam and Eve and goes on, and it seems to, we've got now 8 billion people or so on the earth, nearly, so we're doing rather well. But the earth is far, far, far from full. I should say. Even the UK is something like 97% uninhabited for now. Although we have subdued it, I think, overall, rather well. But how does one increase and multiply? Of course, through the institution of marriage. If we look at how the Lord created Adam and Eve, how Almighty God created Adam and Eve, we start off with Adam, and then Adam seems to be divided in two. That, it often says, taken from his rib. It sometimes says a helpmate in different translations. So the idea is that what appeared to have been momentarily the human condition was good at everything, was the whole picture, was strong and delicate and emotional and hardy, and we were then divided in two. And now, instead, when we form pairs, we form a sort of superhuman, which has, of course, everything that God created in human nature. A married couple, rather than a single person, has, well, for one, 4 hands and 4 legs. We can be in 2 places at once. We can do more things. We can, so it's really a vastly superior condition. And so I think people are altogether coming around to this idea, even without religion, which is interesting. That's simply one person on their own cannot do anywhere near as much and will never be quite as good as a man who is truly masculine and a woman who is truly feminine. That once we specialize, we can specialize so far that put together the team really is superior. That the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, I say. That natural marriage existed since the beginning in this sense. That, of course, Adam and Eve didn't have a wedding ceremony. They didn't have rings and all this, as far as we know. And lots of people, even all the way through the Old Testament, they've got all sorts of different pagan ideas that start to come in. We look at things like the golden calf and all this. People strayed from the faith very quickly, and marriages still existed. That every ancient civilization, as far as we know, I think with very few exceptions, had some form of marriage where a man and a woman would commit for their entire lives. And this has always been the case, but it was, we say, our Lord Jesus Christ who raised it to a sacrament. So before then, there was always what was called natural marriage, and there still is today amongst the people who don't have sacramental marriages. And these are sort of technically considered marriages in the sense that they're natural marriages. So they're not sacramental, so they lack grace. That's the main difference. And if you look at these graceless marriages, or with less grace marriages, you can see that there really is no comparison. If you look at people like the Muslims, the Mormons, who have polygamy still, that's a very interesting example where it's just not the same thing at all. It's not a commitment between one man and one woman. And they said, I read recently that it's considered to be like a game of musical chairs, where in a polygamous marriage there are always too many players and too few seats, and so someone's always left short and so on. And they consider it to be as a solution to a lot of their problems. But things like a husband rotating between wives, I mean, it's by its very nature it turns wives into rivals with one another. It turns children into strangers to their own fathers and things. It breaks the bonds of trust that should exist between husband and wife. Whereas monogamy, they say, is like a dance between just 2 partners rather than more. There are even theorists I read who reckon that in the Middle East and the Arab world, that future conflicts can be predicted by the size of the unmarried military-aged male populations. That because so few high-status, wealthy men have so many wives, there are always going to be more and more unmarried men, and they get frustrated, and they're sort of stuck with no hope of marriage and so on. They lack that civilizing factor, and that civilizing emphasis which marriage has. So they end up. And that seems to be a large cause of wars, which are technically triggered by other things, by sectarian differences and things, but it's a good predictor. There was a recent exchange I read in the papers about Joseph Smith, who founded Mormonism, if anyone's heard of him, which was quite fun. It mentioned that some say he had over 100 wives, some say he had a few dozen, but it's quite well written that he had lots of wives who were sisters to one another. He had some mother-daughter pairs and things. It was all very strange. Some were teenagers. Most of his first wife's friends were married to him as well. And somebody wrote into the paper saying, well, you don't understand over there in Britain that, in America things are different. We had so many hundreds of thousands killed in the Civil War, so many men killed, that it made sense that he was looking after all of these women and so on. And somebody wrote in the next day and pointed out that, of course, Joseph Smith died 20 years before the US Civil War began. Also,
many of his wives were married to other men already.
Yes, a lot of them were married to other men, which is just, it's not marriage essentially. It's absurd that really these things have the same word. But that's what they consider. They consider to be natural law marriages. So, in some places, they were held in extremely high esteem. If you look at ancient Rome, even ancient Greece, there was very little polygamy about for the most part, because people really saw it as such a valuable thing for not just in terms of their gods and their religions and things, but just in terms of the bedrock of the family as the first unit of society and so on. So if you look at the decline of ancient Rome, Caesar Augustus introduced a lot of laws that were supposed to stem the decline, and one of the first things he went for was the family. Then he started to really punish divorce with things like the Lex Julia de Adulteris, where he was going after adultery specifically, with fines, with banishment, even with death for a lot of people, which of course still exists in some religions and in some countries. He made it much more difficult for people to obtain divorces. For a long time, unmarried people, as well as divorced people, were not allowed to attend public games and religious events. They weren't allowed to inherit, to try and encourage people to marry, because he thought that this would really sort out their problems. And as far as we can see, it did stem the decline. But interestingly, if you look at people like Karl Marx and the early socialists, their idea of marriage was really really reductive. And they saw it purely in economic terms, as well as what later became sort of social terms and what we now call Marxist terms, where he saw everything as being inherently a form of oppression, that everything's exploitative. So he thought marriage in particular, because of the difference between men and women, he said that all marriages are exploitation of a vulnerable person, a woman, who was subjugated and forced to perform unpaid domestic labor. And here I think, to some extent, he actually got something right, because it's true that as what later the postmodernists pushed, but it actually does make sense even from the beginning, is that domestic labor that happens at home, cleaning, cooking and so on, ironing shirts and all this, of course is necessary to some extent everywhere, and it has to be done by somebody. So in the past, where perhaps a man was able to go and work in a factory or something 40, 50 hours a week, even more, plus commuting times, travel and so on, then of course getting home tired and hungry and so on, they didn't have much energy to do other things. So they were only really able to do this if there was somebody at home. Usually in their case, if you look at, say, Victorian Britain, a wife, a mother, a daughter, or of course, if nobody was doing the unpaid domestic labour, then it was somebody doing it for money, somebody was paid, a servant of some sort. So if you look at the upper class families and so on, where the women weren't doing these jobs, of course somebody was paid to do the jobs. So it does make sense that domestic labour, I think, should be understood as a form of important labour which allows all other labour to take place. That's true. But to look at it as purely exploitative and is I think, a little bit nuts. But then the modern radical feminists I read took this much, much further, you see, and they see absolutely all male-female relations as being inherently exploitative, which gets really rather mad, to the point where they don't believe that love is possible at all. And any woman who sees herself in a happy relationship with a man has just, I can't remember the word they use, but they've drank in and taken on board these ideas of oppression so deeply that they can't even see them anymore. And all relations between men and women are rape, they even say, which I remember posing to a few people who do consider themselves to be quite radical left-wing feminists, and even they thought that was a bit mad. It's a bit much. But there is something in it, that if you look at one of the big differences between Britain and the United States is that the White House in America has hundreds, perhaps thousands of staff. And people don't mind that in America, that they've got a huge budget, has a whole department in itself. Whereas 10 Downing Street in Britain is a very humble affair, relatively. It's a very small flat, really. And lots of the prime ministers have swapped with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and lived in number 13, because it's a bit bigger. Where there was never any paid servant by the government. Lots of the former prime ministers had their own staff and so on that they've brought in with them. But the very first time that the government paid for an employee for the flat itself was for a cleaner during the premiership of Margaret Thatcher. And this cleaner, secretly, they had to keep this off the books, would also cook. Because the trouble was that when Margaret Thatcher, the PM, was off at international summits and things, her husband, who was Dennis Thatcher, was a rather busy businessman and so on, and he kept ordering takeaways, which was considered to be a security threat. He kept getting Indian and pizzas and so on, because he simply didn't have the time or energy to cook and do domestic labour at home. So even to this day, I believe there's a cleaner on the books, and they're the only employee of the flat itself. Whereas reducing natural marriage down to this way is, if you look at, it's not just the polygamists, not just the economists and the feminists and so on, all these other people who have an idea of what marriage should be. If you ask around in the secular world, people see it as really a commitment for companionship that can be ended with a divorce just as easily as it was obtained in the first place by a civil marriage. And looking at those definitions, there really is no defense against the ideas that why can't a man marry another man? Why can't a woman marry a woman? Why can't a man marry his dog if he really likes the companionship and wants to make a lifelong public commitment? Why can't they marry a fictional character? Because what all of these definitions lack is the first purpose of marriage, which is, of course, procreation. That St. Augustine, of course, wrote, proles fides sacramental. It's not just proles. He's not calling everyone proles. Is that the government alarm?
Yes, I've never seen that before.
Yes, thank you very much. Was your phone on airplane mode?
Oh, so it worked, didn't it?
Was it on airplane mode, your phone?
No.
Only yours then?
We should have had a control.
There was, yes, so that's the control. Mine was on airplane mode, it didn't go.
Oh, yours was.
No, we know. Either way, so return to that, is proles fides sacramentum, just means offspring, faith, and sacraments, which is what he considered to be the three purposes of marriage. And looking at this more deeply, you see that, yes, if the first purpose is offspring, then it really makes sense that no other form of marriage can make sense, that it has to be a man and a woman. Interestingly, in the definitions of the church, sterile people, as far as they know, can get married, because nobody knows they're sterile, really, until they're married, whereas impotent people cannot. So the difference is people who cannot perform the act cannot get married, for whatever reason, if they had some horrible accident or something. But sterile people, as far as they know, can, because also, as we'll know, God and medicine these days can often fix sterility as well, if they look into it and such. But they have to be able to perform the act, so that everything they do is open to life. You see, whereas anything else just really distorts things. And the trouble is, even what I'll come to later, is the idea of other purposes of marriage, because there are other purposes, and even purposes of the marital act, which they consider to be conjugal love, the idea that it really brings two people together. To have that as the second purpose of marriage makes an awful lot of sense, because not every marital act will result in conception, but it will still do good within a married couple. So the main comparison in the New Testament to a marriage is Christ and the church. That if the church is a bride of Christ, then, well, how does that look? So if Christ is a sort of husband figure, then what does he do for the church? Well, the big case is, of course, self-sacrifice. That, obviously, he sacrifices his life to redeem us in the way that a husband doesn't necessarily give his life, but sacrifices his living life rather than the end of his life, in the sense that what he does for his wife is that he puts aside all of his selfishness and so on to do something that's good for the wife and for the family. Whereas, what does a wife do for the husband in terms of what does the church do for Christ? Well, some people reduce this down to, well, the church makes pretty buildings, beautiful buildings, which are well adorned. There was a famous quotation I got here by a Protestant pastor who became a Catholic, who was from the mega churches, the great big wooden buildings with smoke machines and projectors and so on. And he always wondered, why have Catholics got such expensive, ornate, gold-decorated churches? And he says, well, he realizes it wasn't for worship, it wasn't for the meeting place. It was a home for Jesus Christ himself in the Blessed Sacrament. And reductively, this can be compared to a wife making a pretty home, which is an amazing thing to behold in itself. But it's not everything. It's that is that the wife, St. Paul also writes, sees and respects the husband as the head in the way that Christ is the head of the church, in the way that the wife is the heart of the marriage. This is often compared to the wife symbolizing mercy, whereas the husband symbolizes justice, is often the case, and that together they form something that is just and merciful, which is the image of God. The idea that humans are created in the image of God makes sense in this way, and that this respect involves recognizing and valuing the unique qualities of men as husbands and their role in the partnership of marriage, and it involves deferring to them as the role of the leader and the protector of the family. And by fulfilling that mandate, both husbands and wives can leave a really, fulfilling, healthy foundation in a relationship that's built on, say, mutual love and respect. But most importantly is that it is the biological need that for procreation it has to be a man and a woman, whereas who are not sterile and who can be sterile but cannot be impotent, as I said. Whereas it's a committed marriage that is not the biological, but then the social need for raising those children, not just creating them, because they also need to be raised. So you might be wondering, should you get married? Well, should everyone get married? Well, St. Paul says no. St. Paul continued the tradition of our Lord Jesus Christ in not getting married, interestingly. And the way he writes about it almost seems a bit harsh, really. That he says, as it says, that it's good for a man not to touch a woman at all, really, and that if you absolutely have to, if you absolutely can't control yourself because you're such a helpless weirdo and freak, then perhaps you can. Really, if you must, you can get married. Is the way he talks about it as a remedy for concupiscence. That if you're so selfish and primitive that you can't help yourself, then all right. If you really have to, it is better to marry, it says here, than to be burned. In some cases, it says than to be burnt for passion, meaning to sin, to fornicate in some way. And clerical celibacy also comes from this tradition of St. Paul really then giving his earthly life not to one person, not to a family, but to the whole church, in the way that priests do. And I remember an old uncle telling me that he didn't understand this really until he saw a priest sitting with a dying person every night for a week. And he realized then that if this priest had a family, there's absolutely no way that he'd be able to do that. But as it was his full-time job to go around saving souls as best he can, it really makes sense. And Pope Francis, of course, recently called this a temporal institution, which was widely mistranslated as him saying that it was a temporary institution, which caused a lot of uproar in the press. But he does mean that it's the idea of clerical celibacy does come from tradition. It's not sort of explicitly laid out that every one of the apostles was celibate, because as far as we know, they might not all have been. Although his sneering tone can sometimes be a bit discouraging, I think. But St. Augustine says something similar. He says, if you desire to be chaste, do not delay the beginning of your family. And this, I think, makes a lot of sense, that premarital abstinence can be very difficult for a lot of people, especially those who feel that they don't have a religious vocation to celibacy and therefore they ought to get married. They can then find that very difficult, especially these days when people get married at an older and older age. So whereas in the past people got married on average a bit younger, it says that that does make chastity easier as well. That also beginning the marriage sooner is more easy as well to remain chaste within the marriage, he reckons, because children come sooner. But what he then said is that he does recognize the frustrations of young people, but of course, as everyone in the church will tell you, it is all worth it. But I won't go into how one meets a future spouse or any of that, because I think that's all too individual and so on. But once a match has been created, has been engaged, there are three distinct steps, which is that a couple gets engaged. Traditionally, of course, in our culture, a man proposes to a woman. Generally, in a lot of Europe, women can be expected to propose to men on the 29th of February, so once every 4 years on a leap year. And this does actually take place. Whereas it's a fairly modern idea that for an engagement, a man ought to buy an expensive engagement ring. But you can see where this comes from. It's an initial investment. It's an early display that the man is sufficiently committed that there's a higher cost to withdrawing from the affair. And this, I think, makes sense in the sense that once engaged, what a couple ought to start doing is planning the wedding and so on. And the way to do that is very difficult if there's this constant idea hanging above their heads that they could break it off. So it's very common these days for men to get the engagement ring blessed by a priest, either before the engagement or after, to confer some grace upon the engagement, because it tends to be more difficult for women, because of course men, by the time that they've decided to propose, and they of course don't necessarily need a ring, this is only a modern tradition, they've already decided that this is what they want to do, whereas women are more likely to spontaneously agree and then only really think it through a bit later. So they can find that quite difficult. So in the Catholic Church, the next step would then be what's called a betrothal, which is very rare these days, especially in the UK. There's somewhat of a comeback more recently in traditional communities in France and the USA, but in England it's still quite rare, where rather than an engagement being just between two people, they will also go to a priest. And there's a ceremony for this in lots of old missals. It's quite short, it's quite beautiful really. They could invite their families too. And this then confers more grace because they've committed now not just to each other, but also in front of God. And this of course makes breaking the agreement even more costly, and at this point really to break an engagement is always a shame, but sometimes it's the right thing to do, whereas to break a betrothal really requires a very serious, grave reason, because of course one of the important points about marriage is that feelings obviously do come and go. They get stronger, they get weaker, but there has to be some element of commitment, and a betrothal is exactly that. So really to break a betrothal, it should be something like adultery that breaks it up. And then the next step, usually immediately after engagement, sometimes immediately after betrothal, is to talk to a priest. And the church, being a very old institution, works on very old rules, and it still works mostly administratively on the basis that people go to their local parish church. And there was a time in medieval Europe in lots of places where it was considered a sin not to go to one's own parish church on a Sunday, not without written permission from the priest that one was going elsewhere. And this was based on a system where the priest knew everyone and everyone knew one another in their area. And it's quite fictional now really, that so many people go to mass in different places and so on. But there's still an element of this in that to get married elsewhere, the first thing the priest will ask you is, were you baptized and were you confirmed in the church? And they won't just believe you, they'll require the certificate, and the certificate is in the parish where you were baptized. If you were confirmed, then at the confirmation they will also send a copy of that to the church where you were baptized, and that's considered to be your parish church, even if it was, as in lots of cases, in another country to where you live. And formally then, you ought to get married in your parish church too, which these days, of course, most people don't. Very often, of course, if two people are from different parishes, the most often are, one will be expected to get permission from their own priest, the priest where they want to get married, and from the bishop. Sometimes the bishop of both dioceses, but really these days this is a formality. It's usually automatically given and so on. But this is something that might concern a lot of you, is that getting married outside of the regular parish structure, if you want to get married with traditionalists like even the Society of St. Pius X or other priests who are roaming around out there, then they can ask for the delegation, for the permission from the bishop, and some bishops will grant it, but not an awful lot. And what then happens is the sacrament is still valid, but it may be considered illicit, which is administratively usually fine, because they'll simply send the marriage certificate to the parish where you were baptized, and usually nobody will blink an eye, they'll just see a marriage certificate. But for very few people this does cause some problems later in life, that the regular diocesan church system might consider someone who was illicitly married not to be married at all. But this is very, very rare. But I know lots of you operate in this category of valid but illicit quite a lot anyway, and it doesn't really bother you. Because what's important about the sacrament of marriage is that it technically doesn't even require a priest to be valid, but if a priest is available, then one really ought to be there. Because the sacrament itself is conferred by two people, by the couple themselves. The priest is merely there to preside, to bless it, and so on. But realistically, it's not something that should ever really happen without a priest. And it should be written down in all the right places and so on. But then, because then after the contact with the priest is made, there's no strict formal sense of this, but they will usually engage in some sort of marriage preparation, which I've heard horror stories that sometimes this can be, a large group of 100 couples, some of which aren't engaged, some of which are single people even, who will just have a quick PowerPoint on natural family planning or similar, and they will be considered prepared, and that's it. Whereas some priests really do take the time. They'll take a couple individually. They'll go through a book. They might also expect you to read a book. They might expect it to be a series of lectures. They might pick conversations. I've heard of some where there were competitions between couples as to how well they know each other and so on. But this all comes from the fact that for the sacrament to be valid, not only must the two people be eligible to get married, but there must be full consent. Not like with baptism, where a godparent can give consent on their behalf, that both people must fully understand what marriage is. And it's, of course, impossible usually to prove that this was not the case. So it's a very rare, if ever, cause for invalidating a marriage. But some priests really do take this very seriously, and it's worth doing your own research as well. But the full consent thing, I mean, it's because there are reasons why a marriage can be invalid and declared invalid after the fact, which is called an annulment. In the past, these were very strict procedures, that what was considered to be not complete consent is that somebody on the day was drunk, that somebody was mentally unwell, and if it was a case of fully mistaken identity, that they hadn't checked each other's identification and so on, which is very rare. It's not things like, I didn't know that he supported another football team or something. I didn't know what this person was really like, because nobody knows what anyone else is really like. Not in that sort of deep sense. Anyway, and so on. So full consent is also if it's happened under duress. So usually at the very end of marriage preparation, to confirm eligibility, the priest might ask a series of questions. This might even happen with the wife and the husband, or the bride and groom in separate rooms, to ask if the other one has, for example, I've heard of some people being asked, do they have a tendency to homosexuality? Or do they have a tendency towards gambling addiction, or alcohol addiction, or drugs and things? Is anyone else going to financially benefit from your marriage, or politically benefit from the marriage and so on? And these can all be considered forms of duress or incomplete consent. The idea that someone lied about being rich or something is not considered to be a valid reason. Although there are very rare cases of people concealing very large debts, in which it's an extremely exceptional case where the church might even permit a legal divorce, but not a separation, simply to separate the assets between the two, while they're expected to still be married, of course, which is it's an extremely rare thing, which we'll probably never ever come across. But the point there is, it's a really one-way thing. That I think it was Chesterton compared it to sending a letter, and in that sense it's romantic, that you put it in the post box and it's gone forever. You can't stop it, you can't bring it back and so on. That it's very much a one-way street, and that it essentially is a bit of a death cult. It's a bit of that you are both engaged in this agreement until one of you dies. That is the only way that it really ends. They are one flesh, which it sometimes is translated as no man can render asunder, or no man can wrench asunder. So it has to be absolutely indissoluble fidelity, which is really quite a beautiful thing. It's quite a relief for a lot of people, I find. But this idea of some then retroactively being annulled, as I said, really was a very rare thing. That one of the most popular reasons amongst high society kings and things was that the marriage was never consummated, that the couple never engaged in the marital act for whatever reason. And this was somewhere that people sometimes probably did lie a bit, but they couldn't if they had children, for example. unless they could prove adultery, which in the past was very, very, very hard to do until DNA tests and so on. And those who get married outside of the diocesan structure can appeal to I believe the SSPX have a tribunal in America where they can deal with these sorts of decisions. The one here in London is actually just around the corner here at Vaughan House. But there was quite a scandal recently where the trouble is, in the last 40 years or so, the number of annulments has skyrocketed. It's gone all over the Catholic world, and there has been some revision to the rules, but mostly not at all. And the revisions that were there were back in, I believe, the 70s, perhaps even the 1982 Code of Canon Law. And there the trouble was recently Pope Francis said to the bishops that they ought not to make annulment difficult, that where they can, they ought to make it easy for people who want one to get one. But he didn't change any rules. So there were bishops, like I believe that in Wrocław in Poland, who said, well, they haven't changed the rules. We're going to simply stick to the letter of the law and make things as difficult as they can for anyone who wants an annulment. And then in places like that, they dropped. But almost everywhere else, this went from, I believe in the US, it was something like 100 a year in the 1950s to something like a few thousand a year. In some cases, even tens of thousands in some countries. So it has been taken to be a sort of Catholic divorce in lots of places, which is a terrible shame. Because it ruins the idea of the whole thing. Which is why a lot of people say that they don't feel comfortable getting married in a diocesan church, that they don't feel they can be properly prepared, and so on, and they ought to go to somebody else for a valid wedding. That what the clergy will say is that of course there will be issues in a marriage, and they must try absolutely everything to end them. That they must go to a priest first. If they have to, they must go to a psychiatrist. They must go to counselling and so on. There has to be a conciliar attitude within the couple, and if absolute worst case scenario, in some cases like abuse and so on, there can be separation as a temporary arrangement, but really this ought to end because the grace is there, the tools are there, everyone has everything they need for a marriage to be happy. And I believe it was C.S. Lewis who said that really there is no man and no woman who is truly compatible. Men and women are so different. And I suppose he meant by characters and so on. And of course, they are extremely different, but it doesn't matter because you just sort of, as long as you decide that the marriage ought to work, then it will work. And that's it. It's sort of, and this was always the case for the history of the vast majority of your ancestors, even those who weren't Catholics. Even in the Anglican Church, in the Eastern Orthodox schism and so on, divorce is a relatively recent thing. And it was relatively rare for the majority of people in the time that it was around. That it really is, I mean, there's wonderful language here. Lots of priests will recommend the encyclical Casti Connubii by Pope Pius XI, but lots will also recommend writings of Pope Pius X, which will say wonderful things like this, that it really does end in death. Till death do us part, I believe, was part of the Anglican rite. It was in some Catholic missals, but not in all. There is some discrepancy across time, because of course marriage has existed in this sense longer than the church has. So it's existed in lots of cultures longer than the church has been in those cultures. So while the sacrament is a sacrament, the actual ceremony around it does vary a bit from country to country and has varied over time. So lots of the vows that you see in films and things might be Anglican, or they might be specific to a country, but they're not all the same, even in every 1962 missal in the world.
The Anglican ones were originally Sarum, I think.
They might have been Sarum, right? That would make a lot of sense, which is why they've disappeared from the Catholic Church.
They changed the translation.
That if it's a divine institution, it ought to be treated as such. And there will always be cases where the teaching of the church conflicts a bit with the law of the land, especially in non-Catholic countries, but even in formerly Catholic countries. That, of course, once divorce becomes legal in a country, what is a Catholic to do? And the conflict here is that the church has always said that natural law has to come above state law. If the state mandates something that is unnatural, then we're not obliged to do it. But church doctrine comes even above above everything else. That if there's a conflict between the church law and the state law, then the state law can be ignored. That of course, it's legal in lots of countries to get divorced. It's legal in some cases to kill babies and things, but that doesn't mean that we're allowed to do it, and that it is a superior law to which we obey, which we are obedient, and it's been an interesting conflict in the two, because the state then also likes to pretend that they don't recognize religious marriage, that they only recognize civil marriage, but this is fictional in the sense that, for example, most states will have laws that they don't allow any sort of religious community to marry people who don't also get a civil wedding, because they don't want people having lots of religious weddings which aren't on the books as legal. This is a big problem in the UK with Muslim polygamous relationships, for example, that only the first wife might be legally the wife of the man, and the rest have no recourse in the courts. Things not in the state courts. So it's one of these absurd contradictions in the modern era that a Protestant church of some sort even could have its license taken away if they've been marrying people who aren't legally allowed to get married by the state. And for example, somewhere where a state forbids same-sex marriage, and it happens in some Protestant church, they do kick up a fuss. It is considered a crime in some countries. Whereas some might ask, of course, what about the Old Testament? Weren't there polygamous marriages there? Weren't there unchristian marriages there, and so on? And this is the excerpt of the Gospel of Matthew, where Christ is talking to the Pharisees in the temple, saying, well, what about all the people that Moses gave divorces to, and so on? And Christ says, well, it was tolerated because of the hardness of their hearts, that society was in such a mess at the time, that God allowed a lot more of these things to take place. He didn't necessarily stop them. There was no specific law against them. And that although it does, our Lord does appear to say that whoever shall put away his wife except for fornication and marry another committeth adultery, which seems to imply that one could put away his wife for fornication, which seems to be, this is one of these sort of, seems like a mistranslation where he means adultery, but it's hard to be exactly sure. So in the commentary in the Douay-Rheims Bible, it says that what they mean here is he's still talking about separation. Our Lord is still talking about separation. He's not talking about divorce. That even the husband cannot still marry another person as long as the wife is alive. So if we go into a bit about what I mentioned earlier about the idea of commitment, that what do we mean by love at all? What is it? You might recognize the difference in, I believe it's St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. This idea of, is very often read at marriages now. This idea that love is kind, love is patient, love does not boast, all of these things. And in modern translations, this is often then referred to as something that is talking about conjugal love between a man and a woman. But most traditionalist priests will say that this isn't about amor, this isn't about eros, this isn't about love between two people, this is about caritas. So it's often also translated as charity, or agape. It's the idea of love for God, and love for the sort of humanity as a whole, not conjugal love in the way we understand it in terms of the marriage. And this is one of the interesting things, that in the nuptial mass, for example, in 1962 missals, they give readings which refer to Christ talking about what God joins together, let no man tear asunder. Whereas in the new rite, in the Novo Sordo, they very often just give this reading here about love being patient, or soul being kind, and so on. And it's one of these things that really typifies the modernism in the church, that they've sort of ignored the bit which is really fundamental, and they've gone with what a lot of people will say is a slight mistranslation, as something that's misused. And that what a lot of priests will say is that really, where do the most saints come from? Where do most good Catholics come from? A lot of people, of course, convert to the faith, and they can be extremely zealous and so on. But still, a lot of Catholics are simply those who were born into the faith. We're called cradle Catholics. And this is most people would say, one of the best ways of saving souls. That as soon as there is conception, there is a soul in a body and so on, and the best thing for it is to be born into a Catholic family, in a Catholic nation, in a Catholic clan, and so on, and that it's the responsibility of the parents to educate that child, and it's the responsibility of the parents to do their very best to save that child's soul, to return that soul to God, as some people say, which is why they say things like demographics matter, that Catholic babies matter, and so on. Because if educating children is the prerogative and the responsibility of the parents, a lot of priests will even say that school should be an exception, that school should be a sort of last resort, even a Catholic school. That if it's not going to give the child the best possible chance of being saved, then it should be only if you cannot do something else. I say that the home is a sort of little church in which parents teach. Parents can even give blessings to their children. And one of the images that we see for parenting is the pelican, which is often also used as a symbol for our Lord Jesus Christ in lots of Catholic art. And this is a pelican which is pecking out, I believe, its own liver or its own heart to feed its chicks when they have nothing to eat. And this symbolizes the idea of the self-sacrifice of the parents, that even if they have absolutely nothing, they must do their best for their children. And what's interesting about this is that pelicans are one of the only species of animals who look after their old. They look after old pelicans. That once most animals are no longer able to fend for themselves, they just starve and die. But pelicans are one of the few where the middle-aged ones that can still hunt and still do things and so on will feed the old, but they'll make very careful that they do so in front of their young, so that their young do it as well to them when they're old. It's a bit of a pension scheme in a sense. It's very clever, which is why it's one of the more interesting symbols that you might see in a lot of churches in stained glass windows and things. That the countries which have the lowest percentage of crime, for example, that is committed by under 18-year-olds, by adolescents, are the countries with the strongest families, with the most Catholic marriages in the West, with the most strongly religious marriages in non-Catholic countries and so on. That it is a bit of a problem that fathers these days are often portrayed in Hollywood and so on as being sort of absent, silent investors who aren't really involved in the upbringing of the child. That they're just good-natured oafs is very often the case. Or they're despotic tyrants that are abusive and so on. They just hand over the pay packet at the end of the week, and so that and they relinquish all their rights over the children, so that they can have a quiet round of golf and read their papers and so on, and not really be involved. They just say good night and that's all. And whereas. Yeah, and this is one of the harbingers of the end of the society and so on, when men aren't taking their role as the head of the family, the protector, the provider, the representative of God's justice, whereas the mother represents the mercy. And if you look recently, I mean, there's quite a severe case, more in recent times than ever before, about world leaders being childless, and lots of people are worried about this, that they think that these people aren't as invested in the future and so on, that they act sometimes like a middle-aged couple who's determined to spend all of their wealth before they die, so that they don't give it to the state or to some ungrateful nephew or something, as that this isn't a problem in itself, that the childless can be incredibly self-sacrificing and so on, and can do a lot of good for society, but and that's not just the consecrated celibate, but children are seen as being an investment in the future, which is one of the reasons why people are now having fewer children than ever before, which is what I'll come to. That is, what is wrong with the world right now? And there will be a couple of vulgar terms here. That what are the reasons why the birth rate is declining? What are the reasons why people aren't getting married, people aren't having children? There could be a lot more reasons up here. War being one that could be associated with pessimism, really, in the sense that it's not just people being killed in wars, not just young men dying in wars or civilians being killed in wars. It's also the overall idea of trauma, that people who generally have a dim view of the future are less likely to have children. And you often hear this, especially from climate alarmists and so on, that they don't want to bring children into a world that is so bleak and so on. And this is this is really a very sad thing, because this shouldn't affect Catholics at all. Yes?
I noticed smoking is on there twice.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's an accident. Forgive me. Yes, alcohol, smoking, and drugs, and smoking again later. Yes, because it is very important that smoking does, to some extent, if people smoke enough, can lead to impotency. It can lead to cancers and things. Chemotherapy, rather than most cancers, can really damage fertility. Inflation is just another idea of pessimism there, really. If you look at transgenderism, while it's a very sad thing overall, if you think about it medically, it is essentially chemical castration, is what it is, and it prevents fertility. Yes, does anyone have any questions about these? Yeah.
So the ones that most leap out to me are university, Teflon,
yeah, so
travel.
One at a time, please. So what effects does university have? Well, it's a delay in, it extends adolescence, most people find. So on average, those who go to university have children later than those who don't. And this means that those who, and of course it's also the case that those who have children later are likely to have fewer children. Whereas it's also the case, and that's in particular for women, where the woman in the relationship goes to university. Overall, they have far fewer children, and the ones that they do have, they have later. Teflon is, I can't remember the exact chemical in it, but it has been associated in quite a few studies, even in mainstream press, as it might be to do with estrogen, but it might be something else. Can't remember exactly. I'll have to get back to you on that one. It does decrease fertility, in particular in men. What was the next one? Travel. That's an interesting one, because you think it wouldn't either, but this is one that comes from something I was going to say later, which is that overall childlessness, or having fewer children, deciding to have fewer children, is essentially a public commitment to selfishness rather than to the good of society and so on. And it's also on record in statistics that those who travel more spend more money on themselves, they're more likely to be more individualistic, which is on there as well, and they end up having fewer children, and having children later. If you think about young people these days who, for whom travel is so widespread that they can go around the world as often as they like, they go on gap years, they can go to Asia for a week and so on. They spend a huge amount of money on accommodation of flights. Whereas people who take fewer holidays abroad have children younger. So it seems a silly one, and it's not a necessary one, really. That of course people could do both, but there is a statistic, there's an average. Does anyone question any of the others?
Well, I don't
what sticks out?
sound like a terrible liberal, but NFP, although I know what you're getting at, that people misuse it, use it when they are not allowed to, but there are circumstances when it can be used.
Yes.
It's not very common.
For those of you who don't know, natural family planning, NFP, this is something that I believe the church picked up on. It's been around, I believe, for the entire 20th century, maybe a bit longer, but the church picked up on it. Yes, but the church picked up on it a bit later, I think, maybe 40s, 50s. And that
the first time they were asked about things relating to it was in the 1850s.
Could be.
Yeah.
But it... Well, yeah, so the trouble with it is, what it is some people also call it the calendar method of contraception, because a lot of people say, well, it's not contraception, but that is essentially the way it's used. This is the idea that a couple will engage in the marital act only at the times on the calendar where they know that they're not able to conceive. And the church does, depending on the priest to whom you speak, because I've never seen it actually written down in any church documents, and I've looked, which is that a lot of priests will say that it's permissible to allow a gap of 3 years between each child if a mother found childbirth particularly difficult. It's allowed once a couple has 5 children, and therefore their obligation to the church is considered to be fulfilled, and if they don't want to have any more, they don't have to. And it's allowed, of course, if there's any risk that a pregnancy or childbirth could lead to the death of the mother. So it's a decision which some couples do take, and it is contested, as you see. Is 5 children enough, and so on.
There are different opinions. I think there are two.
I've heard that, I should say, from contemporary traditionalist priests, but not in any documents, only verbally.
The documents are hard to find, but they do exist.
Yes.
I think Bishop. Well, I don't know if this is not allowed on camera, but I think Bishop Filiorum has talked about it.
Perhaps he has.
He's got the documents.
Yeah, I wouldn't go by his.
He's found the documents.
Okay, but I wouldn't go by his. I think the point is he's a guy who said
Yes.
he's a guy whose public position is everything was perfect in the church until this. And the point is, this is a classic example of where it wasn't, and you had people. What counts as a big family now is, yeah, you're right, 5 children. Wow, you have so many children. If you
Yes.
look at Catholic families in the 50s, 40s, 30s, and before, perfectly normal to have 12 children, 15 children.
Can you all hear this?
Among people who are really, really, really poor.
Yep.
Irish immigrant families in London, Liverpool, Manchester.
I'll come to that.
Newcastle,
Yes.
15 children.
Yep.
And, yeah.
Yep. So the trouble with NFP is that even if the church has allowed it in some circumstances, it's one of these things that has become massively overused because it is then used as contraception deliberately by couples who don't want to have more children or don't want to have any at all. Very often you'll hear of couples now who get married and they say, well, we don't want a child for at least a year or two. And you'll very often hear, so we can travel, I'll say, because holidays become more expensive and so on once there are children involved. One that some people might contest on here is the jab. What of course talking about there is the coronavirus vaccine. This has been in mainstream press that a lot of women have suffered an end to menstruation, they've said, far ahead of time, 20, 30 years ahead of time, as a result of the jab. And this is, I believe, tens of thousands in the UK alone on record. This isn't a conspiracy theory at all.
Soya then.
Soya, yes. So
why is that?
soya and beer could be on there individually. A few other foods are naturally estrogenic. So estrogen is considered to be a feminine hormone. It's sort of considered to be the opposite of testosterone. A small amount is normal in men. A lot is normal in women. It's part of the natural makeup of hormones and so on. Too much in men decreases testosterone to the point where it decreases fertility, and even causes some men to grow breasts in what's called, I believe, gynecomastia, if they have enough estrogen, which usually comes from, for most men these days, soya, beer. So the soya very often comes from meat replacement foods, sort of vegetarian sausages and things. That's the main cause. Microplastics are one that's being studied a lot more recently, but there really is a matrix of attacks. This is a matrix, but there's been a lot of different things that are trying to reduce the birth rate. And one of the interesting ones on there that a lot of people don't consider is sexually transmitted diseases. A lot of them cause infertility, and people don't even know about it. The most common one by far was I believe, called the human papilloma virus, which causes herpes, which in the vast majority of men has no symptoms. They won't even know they have it. And it causes in women, I believe that the cervical cancer rate is 10%, which causes infertility. So this is really tens of thousands. And the governments I believe the UK, the US, a few European countries are just beginning to pick up on this now because there is no cure. In men, it often goes away within a couple of years. In women, it might never. There's a vaccine, but there's no cure. So they're beginning to push the vaccine for HPV, as it's called, on teenagers. There are plenty of others which have absolutely no symptoms, sometimes for years, which cause infertility. I believe gonorrhea is one. And they're getting more sophisticated every few months with the effect of insufficient antibiotics and so on. So some are curable, some are not. Some are only curable if they're caught early enough. And lots of people see this as the fight back of nature. Some people compared it to, I heard, stinging nettles. That I used to wonder that if you look in any public park or public lawn which is not looked after, you'll see a lot of stinging nettles. They can grow huge in the summer and so on. And I wondered, before there were more people on the earth, when a lot more of the earth was unexplored and so on, was it all full of stinging nettles? Because if you don't look after a park, they grow like mad. And it turns out it wasn't, simply because they grow only in quite severely polluted soil because of things like sulfur and so on. So they were a relatively uncommon thing until the modern era. And now, especially in cities, they're everywhere. And this is considered one of the ways in which nature fights back against people who fight against nature. And STDs are considered to be another one. That STDs could die out in a generation if promiscuity died out in a generation. If the traditional Catholic doctrine on marriage, on premarital abstinence, was upheld, then there would be no more STDs for the most part. I should mention HPV can also be contracted through kissing, but not many of the others.
Can I ask you about overpopulation?
Yes, so the fear of overpopulation. This is one that really gets me because yes, have you heard of Parson Malthus? Is he on that? I named him originally, but I might have taken his name off. Parson Malthus he was born mid-18th century, I think died mid-19th. He was a vicar who did some maths, did some calculations, and he worked out that the world's population was growing faster than the food supply. And this, as he rightly calculated, would mean that at some point the population overtakes the food supply and there are famines. And so he thought, despite being an Anglican vicar, which one would think would be against this sort of thing, he absolutely disdained marriage. He couldn't stand the idea of especially poor people, the lower classes, having children, because to some extent he was very popular amongst the early economists. He started mixing more with economists than even other priests, because he was very much about supply and demand, and he was doing very basic calculations which show, if we've got a certain amount of food, if we've all got fewer children, then we'll all have more food each, and so on. We've got more land each, and so on. And the maths wasn't wrong. But what he absolutely couldn't take into account was the fact that humans are different to other animals. Because, of course, when you study other animals, you see that their populations tend to depend on their availability of food. So you'll often see one animal, because a certain plant overpopulates, and the animal that eats it overpopulates, and the animal that eats that overpopulates in a sort of chain reaction. And then as they all collapse, the others collapse one by one as well. And you see this, famously this happened in Australia with the rabbits. So there were what were called rabbit plagues, where there were, at one point when the rabbit was introduced, they bred so quickly and there were so many of them that they ate all the grass and all the vegetables, spanning for hundreds of miles, and then there was a mass starvation of rabbits. They called it a rabbit plague. But one of the ways that they tried to get rid of the rabbits, interestingly enough, was that they put up a lot of fake rabbit models, which in rabbit terms, by the shapes of their ears and things, were considered more attractive than real rabbits. So a lot of rabbits tried to breed with these and died out, which is compared to pornography and so on in the modern era. But as I say about Parson Malthus, I think it was Henry George who said that he doesn't take into account that both jayhawks and people eat chickens. But the more jayhawks you have, so we could say this with any bird of prey, the fewer chickens you have, as I said about the supply of food. Whereas the more people you have, the more chickens you can have, because of course we've worked out how to breed the chicken. The chicken now, since the Second World War, I believe is 3 times heavier on average because of the breeding programs and so on that were introduced, so they only breed the larger ones and so on. So what's of course happened is that since the middle of Parson Malthus's lifetime, where there were about 1 billion people on the earth, there are now about 8, and we did not run out of food at any point. And what's interesting is that they teach this very often in the universities towards the beginning, because it'll enforce ideas, because it led to things like eugenics. It leads to a lot of overpopulation scare theories and things, which then contribute, of course, to the climate alarmism agenda. Lots of people talk about overpopulation, and the umbrella is called peakism. If you've heard of peak oil or peak coal and so on, that we've reached a certain peak of a resource, it'll be downhill from here. And that they considered we were expected to reach peak food supply a long time ago. And those who said that what if we have the technology to improve farming, they were considered cornucopianists, so they were considered idiots, they were considered mad fanatics and so on. But that's of course exactly what happened, is that food production has taken off. And this is where what they don't teach until usually a year later in the universities, hoping that you don't notice the two, is that even now they say there is no problem with food supply on the earth. The problem is the distribution of the food, and that's why so many people are starving. If you look at the famines and things that exist in the world, it's an availability issue because of things like capitalism, they'll say. And they try to hope that you don't notice that these two theories conflict. But yes, and because both of them simultaneously influence modern leftist thinking, which is, I find, a very annoying thing. But what else have I got? What could be up there that isn't? Can anyone think of anything? Now that Guy's left, I'll mention cycling. That's considered to reduce fertility rates in men, simply because of repetitive.
You can guess why.
Yes, because of the seat, because of the heat, and so on as well. It's considered to be only a temporary effect for the most part, excepting accidents. Same with horse riding, for example, is considered more of a threat to women than men, whereas cycling is considered more of a threat to men than women, simply because of more serious accidents, not because of everyday riding, which is, as you say, one of the reasons why women used to ride side saddle and such. What could be up there is, which definitely isn't up there, is priestly celibacy. There's a story about St. Ambrose in the Western Roman Empire that for a time he was prevented and discouraged from speaking in public so much because he was causing so many people to take vows of celibacy that it was influencing the birth rate of the Western Roman Empire. But this is not an issue that we have today. There's of course a crisis in vocations overall. Yes.
Could you expand on more radiation?
Radiation, yes. I mean, if you look this up, it usually talks about, I believe, alpha and gamma, but there are more studies coming out about mobile phones being kept in pockets and things, things like Bluetooth, which are considered relatively harmless overall, but some scientists are now beginning to question whether they have a very negative impact. X-rays, certainly, if people are exposed for too long, which doesn't affect most people on average, but for radiographers before they started to introduce the barriers and things, it was a serious issue. So it's one that could become more of an issue in future as there's more and more background radiation everywhere. It's not a leading issue.
Could you also talk about sort of, well, people usually call it intelligence, don't they? But it's more worldly wisdom.
Education, yes. I mentioned that in university.
People who have...
Higher education is a big factor in lower fertility. And that's two things. As I already said before, that's people going to university on average will have children later simply because they've spent all that time at university. It's not the rule. They don't have to do it, but it's an overall trend. But it's also the content of the humanities especially.
I think the point I've often heard is, well, it's sort sorry, it's gone.
If it comes back to you, let me know. But it's also about being taught things like Parson Malthus and climate alarmism and these sorts of things.
It's because the person who is, say got a higher IQ, if they're not religious, will think, well, actually having children is quite a painful thing. Is it really worth it? I don't want to. I'm going to focus on my own pleasure. But if actually they're religious, the higher the IQ is, then they'll have more children.
Yes, that sounds about right. Yep. So it's a world now where young men are especially bombarded with messages of self-indulgence, instant gratification, short-form video, especially, and there's this idea that we want everything now and we don't want to invest in the long term. But traditional Catholic marriage is one of these things that provides a counterbalance to that modern world by emphasizing selflessness, responsibility, duty, these sorts of things. So I'll come into something some of you will find very interesting, which is that one of the arguments against large families is that the Nazis used to reward it. Some of you might have heard of the Mutter Ehrenkreuz, I believe is the bad pronunciation. That's what I'll come to. And they say, well, in the Nazi regime in Germany, they used to reward mothers who had more than 10 children, I believe it was, with a very nice looking medal. If you've seen any of these up close, the blue is really very nice. It's huge as well. It's much larger than most of the military ones which men would get. What they often neglect to mention is that the Soviets, of course, did this. They had a sort of bronze, silver, gold, although it's blue. The French did this for about 40 years. In Poland, even today, anyone who has been married for 50 years gets usually a medal from the president. In the United States, 50 years usually gets you a greeting from the White House. In the UK, I think it's 60 years, usually gets a letter from the monarch, these sorts of things. And that this is, yeah, all right, perhaps the Nazis did this, but so did lots of other people in lots of other places, including liberal democracies. It's not an inherently bad thing to reward people who have a lot of children. Because there are places where public policy is on the side of large families. Two examples that people like to use are Hungary and Sweden, because in Hungary, overall, this seems to work. That Hungary's birth rates are incredibly low. So there's been an effort over the last 10 years to increase them. And a lot of people have seen this as a really nasty, awful, bad thing because of thinking about it in terms of climate alarmism and so on. But there are things like tax breaks, there are things like subsidies for larger cars, I believe women with more than 5 don't pay income tax, or their husbands don't have to pay income tax, and these sorts of things. And in Hungary overall, it has risen the birth rate by at least 10%. Whereas in Sweden, they introduced a lot of similar subsidies and tax breaks, and it hasn't had an overall positive effect. All it's done is people who were already intending to have children had children earlier, because finances became less of an issue. So although the overall trend in Sweden is a decline, what it does is there's always a little spike and then a larger drop than there would have been before, and then a little spike and then a larger drop every time they introduce the policies. But overall, it's quite a problem that most countries know. Although there might be some tax benefits to marriage, there are very few for children. Whereas, and this means, sort of combined with a lot of other factors, of course. The big one is what's called sexual revolution, the contraceptive pill that came around in, 1965 or so. Birth rates are plummeting in Western Europe, in America, and so on. Amongst the native populations, there can be some exceptions made for immigrant populations, especially religious ones. Where birth rates are declining the fastest is in the developing world, in Africa especially, where they were traditionally extremely high. I believe the records were an average of 8 or so in, I think it was Cameroon, which has now dropped to about 2 in the space of about 40 years. And there are lots of reasons for this, one of which is public eugenics programs coming from aid packages from the West. Some are even contraception. And there was a minor scandal in the Catholic Church where a popular Catholic charity, the Order of Malta, was handing out contraception as a part of larger aid packages in Africa. And even the Pope Francis was annoyed about this, and I believe forced the head of the order to resign and replaced him, and put a stop to the contraceptive part. For those of you interested in economics, you ought to note that most modern economies are reliant on the idea of constant population growth, that large funds are able to borrow huge amounts of money to build these dreadful new build housing estates that you see popping up everywhere in the countryside, depending on the fact that they are going to be rented, that they are going to be mortgaged, that the best case is that they're mortgaged by someone who dies and never pays it off in full on a high interest mortgage, so then somebody else can also get a mortgage and so on. And as the birth rates drop, these funds aren't willing to lose all their credit, so they tend to start pushing immigration to replace population and even make sure that it grows. And if that's something that's interesting to you, the only real way to counter it is birth rates. Yes, please.
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't really get the relation.
That large investment funds depend on a growing population, especially in developed economies. And partly because of expecting more people to go into the workplace, partly because of building large housing estates and so on, especially these large, ugly new build estates. But also a big one is pensions, that as the birth rate declines, there's a higher proportion of old people, a higher proportion of pension recipients than there are pension fund contributors. And that causes a huge, in places like France, I think almost half of the state budget goes on pensions. And they've tried to raise the minimum state pension age, and people have gone mad. But they, in some cases, understandably so. But because what the economy needs is a growing base of pension contributors and people who are going to fill these houses, work, pay taxes, pay mortgages with high interest rates and so on. So if an investment fund on a very, very large scale sees that the population isn't growing, it's much faster, rather than to try and increase the birth rate, to simply increase immigration. And this is, of course, the case in much of Western Europe, where populations would have been declining, they're not, because of immigration.
You could suggest that there's something intentional about all this.
Well, yes, very clearly. Lots of these funds are very open about the fact that they encourage immigration because it's good for the economy. Lots of the politicians will say it's good for the economy, that most immigrants pay more tax than they take from the state in welfare and such. So but it's not just that, it's a larger population that's paying rent, or the government's paying rent on behalf of them through welfare packages and so on. And
of those, I would have thought Italy and Spain are probably quite Catholic countries.
I picked them as Catholic countries, yeah, to show that this has affected Catholic countries as much as anyone.
Like it as well.
Sorry?
Poland is another.
Poland's another big one.
Strange.
It was harder to find exact figures.
Religious, but it has or at least it's more than the rest of Europe, but seems to have a rather low birth rate.
Yes, and this is something that hasn't popped up just yet, but I might as well bring up now, is that one of the major scandals of the Second Vatican Council, which most of you may have heard of, was that there was, in the documents, an inversion of the purposes of marriage. That in the papers there were two purposes, one being procreation, the second being conjugal love, in sort of longer sentences. And for the first time in the history of the Church, they put conjugal love first. That conjugal love is the first purpose, procreation is the second. That procreation is an optional extra. And this very quickly led to things like NFP, which had only recently been approved by the Church, taking off on a huge scale. And this is why the Catholic birth rate in particular has fallen through the floor. The number of, there are statistics which I haven't got written down here, on the number of Catholic women using artificial contraception. And it's well in the 80s, of I think 80%, at some point in their lives. So it's not every day, it's not regularly, it's not necessarily within the marriage. And it's all really rather shocking considering that the Church teaching is so clear, but it doesn't mean that every priest teaches it clearly. Yes, it's rather huge. Because I remember that when I heard this, it said that the first version of the survey was that how many Catholics have used some contraception in their lives. And a lot of people said, well, they're probably including NFP in that. So they did it as just purely the weird scientific artificial forms of birth control that exist, things like IUDs, things like copper coils, all these very strange things. Especially the contraceptive pill, and because many people often find that the parents aren't sufficiently educated to tell their children that the children, especially young girls, are very often offered the contraceptive pill as they're told by doctors that it'll reduce the monthly impact of menstruation, which it can do because it affects the hormones in such a way. There are articles about this recently that that what I think was Pope Paul VI wrote about it in Humanae Vitae, that this will cause long-term problems in the world. Is all beginning now, science is beginning to catch up and realise that of course he was right. In lots of cases it will cause permanent infertility, the contraceptive pill, as well as increasing promiscuity, especially amongst the unmarried, which leads to things like STDs and so on. It all has repercussions that overall, it was also in statistics that married people commit less crime. Married people with children commit even less crime, because especially unmarried, frustrated young men, they commit the most crime. They're the ones who fight the wars. They're the most frustrated, sort of angry people that there are, with the least responsibility. They've got the least to lose, especially those who live without their parents, especially those who have been raised in broken households and so on. They commit the most crime. And this is why, it's all connected. Yes, I feel a bit mad saying it, but it is. Even basics like elderly care, it seems to be an economic issue, but it's also just as much a cultural issue, as I said about the pelicans. It's a simple thing that Catholics can also do. But on that, I should also say that most priests, it's another formal doctrine, but most will say that a couple, when they get married, ought to have their own place to live. That it's fairly common, especially amongst historical upper class and lower class, that they would stay with one set of in-laws. Interestingly, Scripture particularly says the man will leave his parents and go to his wife, whereas more commonly it was the other way around, that women would go to the husband's family. But in those cases, the Church generally says that they ought to have their own space of some sort, a sort of a flat within a larger house or something, so that they can really excel and thrive as a couple and have their own space, their own domain, form their own family unit and so on. But this is not to say that they absolutely need to abandon their parents for the rest of their lives now that they've got their own marriage, which is becoming an increasingly common thing, that in Western Europe people don't look after the elderly in their own homes anymore. They send them off to elderly care homes and things, and it's all connected. And a great example of all this in history, if you look at, all these things are yes, all these things, I put divorce on there, which is, it makes sense to be a decrease in fertility, but that it's a great example is, in this country it's King Henry VIII, that of course King Henry VIII asked the Church for essentially a divorce. He wanted to be annulled from a woman with whom he had a daughter, and therefore they had really no grounds for annulment and such. And if you look at the position that the Church was in at the time, this was already after Luther. This was, that any sensible diplomat, any politician, any pragmatist would say one exception's all right. A king in England who they absolutely needed, he'd already been given the title by the papacy of the defender of the faith and so on, that he was really he was going to form an essential part of Catholic Europe and so on, especially because the wife was Spanish and all this, that a lot of people would have thought quite happily they could make one exception and allow him to get his divorce. But the church said no. And this caused such huge damage to this country. Yes, all the dissolution of the monasteries, the cathedrals, the number of souls that have been lost as a result from the church over the last 500 years or 600 years is just, it's enormous, it's unfathomable. But why did the church not bend? Because the church is there to faithfully pass on what our Lord Jesus Christ taught the apostles. So the church suffered the consequences anyway. They lost a lot of power, they lost a lot of buildings, they lost a lot of people as a result. But would that have been so wrong? Would one wife have just been enough for him? Well, clearly no, because what happened to the second wife? She was beheaded, and then he married another one, and then another one, and then another one. He didn't stop at just one. And this is what happens when divorce is allowed. If you look at the Anglican Church, divorce was relatively uncommon until more recently. But any society that allows divorce tends to find that there's always a sort of bell curve, and at the extreme end there are people who get divorced 6, 7, 8 times, even more. It completely demeans the definition of marriage. It loses everything. So if you look at any sort of reform, any sort of revolution, I mean, even the Protestant Reformation in Europe past Luther, I don't think Luther particularly sanctioned divorce, but certainly allowed exceptions. And Lutherans as a whole have extremely high divorce rates compared to Catholics even. And there are Catholics who get legal divorces, of course. If you look at the French Revolution and so on, as soon as they overthrew the crown, one of the first things that they legalized was divorce. If you look at the Eastern Schism, they were pretty slow to popularize divorce, but they did eventually. They allowed more and more exceptions. And like with NFP, once a small window is open, then who knows if it's the smoke of Satan that's coming in. This is one of the reasons why the church has to stand firm, and one of the reasons why you all have to take this very, very, very seriously. That the first thing they attack is marriage, and this is one of the things that Our Lady said at Fatima, that there will be a huge battle over marriage, and there is. The statistics are very, very clear. But what is the solution to all this? One of the big things is, of course, get married young and have lots of children. I think it was Tucker Carlson, who some of you like, said if he's got 3 pieces of advice to anyone, it's read books, get married, and have more children than you can afford, he said. Because a lot of people find this a bit mad, but if you trust in God, it's really not a worrying thing at all. That poor, large families are statistically much happier than wealthier, smaller families. And some people can be quite hard to comprehend, and they might think, oh, well, I know someone from a big family who considered themselves to be a bit of an outcast, or had less time with their parents or something. But there are statistics on this. Poor, large families have children who are statistically happier and feel better off, because a large family forms a community. It forms a little state. It teaches the children growing up how important it is that they get along in a mixed society and so on. All the give and take, which some people later try and get from boarding school in a sort of unnatural way that they ripped from their parents and so on. But that if children are considered to be a blessing and a gift from God, which they are by Catholics, then the materialistic values of society simply cannot blind people to that truth. I keep flipping that by accident. Large poor families, they teach people what's really important and what's really unimportant. That money, things like television, things like even disposable pampers, nappies and things, they're not necessarily that important. The more you speak to people who have been in large poor families, you find that lots of these people didn't have beds for their children. They didn't have cots. The children were on blankets on the floor, surrounded by pillows for a year or so, and they were fine. They were completely fine. They don't remember it. They were comfortable, and so on. It's not necessarily that much of a problem. There is such thing as virtue in poverty. I believe our Lord Jesus Christ even seems to imply rather a lot that it's easier to have virtue if poor. That personal luxury and so on really comes second best, and that's a good thing. That children need catechism, they need recognition, they need affection, they need security. They don't need necessarily designer clothes and holidays and gadgets and private education. One of the biggest fears for parents these days is how will we pay for a good education, how will we pay for university and so on. But children don't necessarily need these things, and I think a lot of people are beginning to wake up to all of that. That we have a basic purpose on earth, and it's the salvation of our souls. And if we have children and souls are conceived in our households, souls are infused into bodies in our households, then we have a responsibility to help with the salvation of their souls as well. That Catholic parents should not fit necessarily, because this gets to a point where we think, well, some people get so obsessed with legacy and children that it becomes this idea of immortality and so on, that we live forever if our ancestors lived through us and we live forever through our offspring and all this, and they absolutely need to have 100 children, they absolutely need to have a son to inherit all their money and their surname and so on, and that's a bit much. It's a classic question to ask, how many children do you want? And it's probably the most important question, because there's only one right answer really for men, and that's as many as God gives. But what's interesting about women is it's a statistical reality that one of the largest factors contributing to how many children a couple has is how many did the wife say she wanted to have at the beginning. If she says 20 at the beginning, they're more likely to have 5 or 6, or even 3. If she says 2 at the beginning, they're almost certainly, it's almost impossible that they'll have more than 2. And so on. So it is a very important question, and really the right answer for a woman too would be as many as God gives. This is something that people don't plan. It happens, and it's a blessing. And accepting the circumstances of medical issues and all this, that amongst their children, people should also not necessarily fear that their own children won't have children. It's also a very common case that as soon as someone has children, they start thinking about grandchildren. And one of the issues in the Catholic world is this has contributed, some people think, to a suffocation of vocations. That if they hear about the possibility of vocations amongst their children, they start to panic and think, I'm not going to have grandchildren and so on. But in reality, the vast majority of people who consider a vocation don't end up ordained, they don't end up consecrated. So it's not that likely anyway. It's a pretty small percentage, and it ought to be regarded as a blessing. That lots of people see it as a fantastic thing that if they have children who are consecrated, then those children are going to pray for them for a very long time, and very much, and that's a great thing in itself. But so it's important amongst children to speak very highly of priests and nuns and monks, and it's because what's most important is that those children who never consider it, the number of them who become ordained is 0, of course. What was that a question?
Oh, no,
No, it's stretching. All right. Yes, so it's important for people to check their homes for influences, because even those who don't have any children of their own will often find other people coming into their home. And if they look around and see what does this home suggest to children is a good thing. What sort of art do they have? What sort of books, magazines are lying around? Technology, especially the layout of the furniture is a big one. Does everything point towards a television? Does everything point towards one another? Is there a table with seats all the way around it, or do people face the wall? I've seen places where people face a mirror while they eat. So, does this encourage Catholic families? You might often find not necessarily. And but what else can be done? What else can you do? I mean, one of the other things that's declined in a huge part is social stigma. And everyone thinks, that's a great thing, that there's no more social stigma. But if you think about it, discouraging divorce is one of the best ways that Caesar Augustus reversed the decline of the Roman Empire. That there are people who, for example, will not invite unmarried couples who cohabit to their events at all. And that's one way in which they explicitly discourage cohabitation amongst unmarried couples. But in that case, should we discourage all natural marriage that takes place outside of the church? Some people would say not necessarily. For example, if as a married person, or even as an unmarried person, if in your own home you've got your own domain, what do you encourage in it? If you have guests who come over who are married outside the church, should you allow them to sleep in the same bed?
Well, are they Catholics?
If they're not Catholics,
If they're not
if they have a natural marriage,
then that's fine. Then that's a valid marriage, isn't it?
most people in the church would say it's an unsacramental but valid natural marriage, and therefore it's fine. Some would go as far as to say no, but I think it's a rarity. Yeah, it's very few. Yeah, so there are all sorts of things that stigma can do. St. Paul says the opposite. He says, let marriage be held in high esteem. So he says, let's encourage marriage in another way.
I think I don't know if you're going to mention it, but with procreation, you're populating heaven. So it's not just about populating the earth; it's about populating heaven as well. So if you see it from that philosophical angle and teach your children it from that angle,
exactly.
That's going to presumably have an impact.
God's plan seems to be for creation of us to take place on earth with our input, with our help. That we take part in creation in a way through conception, and that seems to be the way that souls go to heaven, is via earth, via us. So if people weren't having children, then it's, as you say, it's affecting the population of heaven.
Yeah.
The pessimist would say, and affecting the population of hell potentially. But that's another reason why, why some people say the demographics are everything. That if there's a possibility that children can be born into Catholic families, and they ought to be, as many as possible, to decrease the proportion who are born outside of Catholic families. So I'd say that another thing that comes up a lot in marriage prep and in marriage in general is the idea of infertility, which a lot of people will be surprised is more common than is talked about, because this is something about which there is still quite a lot of taboo. That I believe the official position of the church is that if a couple appear to be infertile, they have a duty to seek medical advice, but not to do anything unnatural. So what's considered natural? Who knows? In some cases it's really clear, things like IVF and so on. The church has always said that's unnatural and it shouldn't take place. Things like test tube babies and so on. But I believe it's one of the reasons why rhinos have been hunted into extinction almost, is that some people find the horns have an effect on fertility and so on. And same with other, I think, in China it was tigers, I believe they had some idea had an influence on fertility. And is that a natural fertility remedy? It's possible, who knows? But the other large thing that happens in the situations, of course, is adoption. That the church has always been pro-adoption. It's never been against it. There are always going to be orphans and so on who require adoption, or even children who aren't orphaned but have been removed from their homes for various very sad reasons and so on. And there are plenty of cases where a couple seem to be infertile, they adopt, and then they do have natural children because of hormonal changes that come from adoption. But yes, it's infertility is still overall a taboo subject, which is why overall one of the troubles with marriage tends to be that young people, especially, once they get married, everyone asks, when are you having a baby? When are you having a child? And for some people this is a very tricky question, because they might realize that they can't, and this applies a lot of unpleasant pressure. And one thing which really surprised me is the rate of miscarriages that take place, because it's something that almost nobody really talks about. That it's something like 1/4 of babies that are conceived are never born alive, which is pretty huge. So if you know a lot of married couples, there's a huge chance you know people who have miscarried and don't talk about it. Which is why, for the most part, when there is a pregnancy, people won't tell you until the end of the first trimester, because a pregnancy is usually about 9 months, so it's divided into 3. And in the first one, it's the highest proportion, that 80% of miscarriages, if they do take place, which is roughly 1/4 of conceptions, happen within that first 12 weeks. So very often within that 12 weeks, a couple prefers to keep it private, so that they don't announce the fact that they've had a miscarriage, which increasingly is being seen as a bit of an issue, that people ought to talk about it a bit more, because it's a natural thing that often happens for completely inexplicable reasons and such. What people are scared of is that they'll have a miscarriage and then people will accuse them, but you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you did all sorts wrong. But it's a natural thing that does happen quite a lot of the time. As I said, 1/4 of babies who are conceived, which is really, really huge, Whereas stillbirths with a baby that's been that has died within the 3rd trimester, so within the last 3 months of the pregnancy, which isn't that much less common, but does happen. Yes. Is it 25 past? Quarter past. Thank you very much. So, which is why a lot of people just won't talk about these at all. So it's important generally not to ask people if they're getting pregnant, when they're getting pregnant, and all these sorts of things, because to a huge extent it is outside of our control. But on this, I would say that I cannot stress enough the importance of finding a Catholic doctor when it comes to pregnancies, because there are so many babies that could have been born who weren't born because the doctors didn't try. Because a lot of doctors simply don't care enough, they don't value life enough. So it's the alternative to a Catholic would be some other doctor who really cares about life. But there are a lot of doctors who could have been born. There are a lot of babies who could have been born, and it is one of the saddest things, because it means that very often the parents won't try. So if you can find a Catholic doctor, if you happen to know one, it's worth asking them to recommend another one even, and get them to recommend more and so on, and just create a bit of a network. Because when there are complications, and there can be very often, it's worth having someone who's really in your corner, who's really going to fight for the survival of the baby. So I'd say, in conclusion, let us remember that marriage is not simply a legal contract. It's not simply a societal norm. It is a sacred bond between one man and one woman in front of God. The family was around long before the state was around. That families formed extended families, they formed clans, these widened, they formed nations, and nations created states, not the other way around. States did not produce families. So if states are working against families, then those states become the enemy of families, they become the enemy of the faith, they become the enemy of God. Was it Psalm 80, Psalm 88? This says, I with a perfect hatred will hate the enemies of God, and so on. That you are allowed in lots of ways to work against the state if the state is not working towards something conducive to traditional Catholic marriage. That there were traditions and customs long before there were laws, and the modern divorce laws that we have, I think, in centuries to come, will be looked back upon as one of the greatest crimes of the current century, amongst, of course, abortion and others. It'll be a testament to the horrible sort of license, selfishness of people in the last 50 years or so, if not longer. And Catholic marriage is about love. It's about sacrifice. It's about commitment. It's not about our own personal happiness. And this is one of the things that a lot of people find difficult to grasp. I believe it's Peter Hitchens, who's an Anglican, who says that the death of a parent is much better for the child than divorce is for the child. But it is true that raising strong, healthy, virtuous children is the only way to ensure the future prosperity of a nation, the future prosperity of the faith. Which is why I really urge you, do not be swayed by corrupt values in our society today. This is the only solid foundation for families, to have this bedrock of duty and responsibility. It gives everyone a defined role in society when people become husbands and wives. There's that passage, or I believe it's St. Paul, can't remember where, it says, in most translations it's, when I was a child I prayed as a child, and now I'm a man I pray as a man. And in some translations, especially in other languages, it actually says, now I'm a husband I pray as a husband, which is odd because St. Paul didn't marry. But the translation there is there to show people that the world changes when people are married. That we ought to be proud of this heritage and so on, and we ought to continue our Catholic traditions and values to ensure that they are passed on to future generations. Many of you won't have been born into a happy Catholic marriage, and that's okay. You can break the cycle, and you can create a good cycle for the future generations in your family. So I'll ask, after, what we'll do is we'll say a prayer, we'll wrap up, we'll go for the rosary, we'll come back, we'll have questions, and then descend into idle chat, I believe. So if I'd ask you all to stand, there's a great prayer for vocations and families, which is in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Ghost. O Lord, grant us priests.
O Lord, grant us priests.
O Lord, grant us holy priests.
O Lord, grant us holy priests.
O Lord, grant us holy priests and many religious vocations.
O Lord, grant us many religious vocations.
Lord, grant us Catholic families.
O Lord, grant us Catholic families.
St. Pius X.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Amen.